they gave us too big a room. And so let's say leave the last 3 rows empty. Everybody there move up so that we have a sense of community, an intimate feeling, so that I can see you, so that you can't hide out back there. Thank you. You guys are in the third from the last row, right? 1, 2, 3. Lots of room down here. How many of you saw the inauguration yesterday? What was your favorite part? Your favorite part? Yeah, what about Beyonce's Star Spangled Banner? It was spectacular, right? What about the poem? Richard Blanco's poem. I thought it was wonderful. I read it this morning. It doesn't read as well as it sounded as he read it before 800,000 people or whatever it was. How about the speech? You approved? The cadence, the Dr. King-like cadence, where our journey is not complete until laying out his agenda, an agenda of freedom for oppressed peoples here and around the world, and for our environment and so on. I thought it was a great day. I'm a sucker for those kind of patriotic events, and I found tears coming down my cheeks. And it actually makes you proud to be an American and hopeful. And freedom of speech in the press is a sign of hope. It makes me proud to be an American, and I hope you too. It's a subject, freedom of speech in the press, that is dear to my heart as a lawyer, as a sometimes journalist, as a teacher, and certainly as a citizen. I practiced law for 45 years. Most of it, almost all of it, was civil rights and civil liberties cases, including, for the last several decades, First Amendment cases involving the freedom of speech or of the press. You can do the math about the 45 years and so on. The journalism career that I had was sketchy, and I don't pretend to be a journalist at all. I've written a lot of articles over the years and so on, but the closest I came to doing journalism was back in the late 70s and early 80s when Channel 9, KQED in San Francisco, the public television station, had a daily news program. Every day they had an hour in the evening of news, and at one point the news director decided that he would like to have specialists come on. So they had the dean of the business school here was a specialist who would do business news, and they had somebody on arts and somebody on science and so on, and they had somebody on law, me. So I did the legal news for 2 or 3 years back in the late 70s, largely reporting on Supreme Court decisions and so on, but occasionally going out and beating the bushes for people to interview and talk to people on the streets and put together a real package of a news story. So I got a sense of how it's done. And then as a teacher, I taught for a year at the Harvard Law School, but that was an entirely different kind of thing. I've been here now for 27 years. I am not a professor. I'm a lowly, untenured lecturer, although I've been here longer than most professors. You can call me professor if you want. You can call me your majesty. You can call me whatever you want, but recognize that I'm not a true professor. I don't have tenure. I don't go to faculty meetings. I don't vote on anything. I just show up here to teach guys like you, and I now have thousands of Cal graduates out there thoroughly grounded in the principles of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And then finally, as a citizen, I happen to think that it is crucial that we recognize the extent to which we have freedom of speech and the press, and where we got those freedoms from, and how fragile they are, how easily they can be restricted. For the former Supreme Court Justice, the first woman in the court, Sandra Day O'Connor, since her retirement, has been going around the country trying to get your generation interested in this subject, not limited to freedom of speech, but to our Constitution, to our democracy, and what makes it work, and what could make it work better. And she was out here in Berkeley a couple of years ago and gave a speech when she said that preserving our system of democracy will have to start with the education of our nation's young people. Knowledge about our government is not handed down through the gene pool. Every generation has to learn it, and we have some work to do. And she referred to a recent poll showing that most citizens know very little about their government. 2/3 of Americans know at least one of the judges on the Fox TV show American Idol, but less than 1 in 10 can name the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So let's test that. How many of you can name at least one judge on the current American Idol show? Some of them are really pretty famous. Put your hand that older. I can't believe. I know ratings are way down, but you still know that. Who are the new ones? I can't pronounce one of her names. Yeah, Minaj it is. And what's it? Yeah. So you do know them. All right. Now the key question: how many of you can name the Chief Justice of the United States? Well, I guess you're better than the average citizen. That is, 95% of you do not know who the Chief Justice of the United States is. But that's better. Well, no, that's not better. That's worse, isn't it? It's worse than the average citizen. Well, that's troubling. Let's see if we can cure that ASAP. And let's look at who's who here. Who are these people? This is the Stockton Elks Club. The guy in the middle happens to be the Chief Justice of the United States. He always sits in the middle in their group picture. And his name is John G. Roberts, Jr. And then can anybody name all of them? Well, let's start on the left, in the front row. Clarence Thomas. Next to him, Scalia, Antonin Scalia. Then Roberts. Then the bland-looking all-American type next to him is, Kennedy. Anthony Kennedy. And next to him, the little woman. Who? Yeah, Ruth Ginsburg. Top left, Sotomayor. She gave the oath yesterday to Biden. Did an excellent job. Next to her is, good, who said that? How do you know that? You keep up, all right, good. And next to him, Joseph Alito, and finally, on the far right in the back, the newest member of the court, Elena Kagan. Well, we'll get to know these people fairly well, and one of the reasons for that is that the First Amendment means what the Supreme Court says it means, no more and no less. We find the freedom of speech or of the press in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which was added to the Constitution in 1791. And it's very simple. It simply says, Congress shall make no law, ... abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Actually, there's a comma. The freedom of speech, comma, or of the press. That language does not answer all of the First Amendment questions about whether somebody has the freedom to, say, on the airwaves, to put nude actors and actresses in sexual poses on broadcast television, or any of a number of First Amendment questions that find their way to the courts. The language of the First Amendment really doesn't answer the questions. The Supreme Court answers the questions, and it is the court that decides what the First Amendment means. Just in the last couple of years, to give you a sample of the kinds of disputes about freedom of speech in the press that the court has resolved, or may very soon resolve, there was the infamous Citizens United case, for example, that threw out most of the restrictions on campaign finance and enabled super PACs to dominate political campaigns. That was in 2010. There was the FCC decision just this last June that involved some, quote, indecent language used by Cher in accepting an award on television, and by others. And the question before the Supreme Court was whether the FCC could regulate indecent material on the airways. We'll consider that case as well. Then there was the violent video games case 2 years ago, where the Supreme Court invalidated throughout the California law that made it a crime to sell a, quote, violent video game to a minor, people under 18. There was the funeral protesters case, where these wacky folks from a Baptist church in Topeka, Kansas, go around the country picketing military funerals, soldiers who've been killed in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they are homophobes, and their signs say so, basically, and blame the United States government, and said God condemns the United States for accepting homosexual behavior in the military. We'll look at that case. Then there are issues that the court hasn't resolved yet, but probably will have to. One of them involves WikiLeaks and the leak by the website of hundreds of thousands of confidential State Department cables. And so on. The alleged leaker, the one who had access to the materials, Bradley Manning, is now about to be court-martialed for serious crimes that will put him in jail for the rest of his life. But can WikiLeaks be prosecuted consistent with the First Amendment for having published the leaked materials? And there's some Occupy-type cases that could go to the court, where the issue is whether a city like Oakland or New York and Zuccotti Park can order the parks cleared of the Occupy protesters, or do they have a First Amendment right to be there? Well, to assist you in understanding all of these issues, there are 3 books that you have to have. One of them is this wonderful little book just published last March by Linda Greenhouse, who was the longtime Supreme Court correspondent for the New York Times. She's not a lawyer. She thoroughly understands the court and how it works. She's a wonderful writer. Pay attention to her writing. It's clear. It's accessible. It's only 87 pages. And it's a great introduction to the court. We'll do an introduction here, but you need to read the book, because 3 weeks from today, your first paper is due. It's on this book. I will post the assignment probably by tonight or tomorrow, so you can get busy on it. Second, in a stunning coincidence, I wrote a book that you should read, that I've assigned parts of, Figures of Speech, First Amendment Heroes and Villains. Do you know who these, I'm sorry, that's the reader, there's the book. Do you know who these people are, these figures of speech? You know who that is? I would be shocked if anybody would know who he is. No? Earl Caldwell's his name. He was a reporter for the New York Times back in the late 60s and the early 70s. His beat, he was based in San Francisco, his beat was the Black Panther Party. And he was the only reporter who basically got access to the inner circles of the Black Panther Party, which was the head of the FBI thought was a menace to our society. And he was subpoenaed by a federal grand jury to come in and testify before a grand jury about what the Panthers were talking about and what they were doing. And he knew that if he went in and appeared before the grand jury, it's all secret in there, behind closed doors, just the prosecutor and the grand jurors, not even a judge. He knew that if he went in there, that his ability to cover the Black Panthers was over, because they would not trust him, that he wouldn't have to go in and spill the beans. So he objected to the subpoena, said he wouldn't comply with it. The federal judge in San Francisco held him in contempt of court and ordered him sent to jail unless and until he agreed to go in and testify. His case went to the United States Supreme Court and involved the issue, you won't find the answer to this in the First Amendment, involved the issue of whether reporters, the press, have special protection for their confidential sources that the rest of us wouldn't have. All the rest of us, when we get a subpoena to go testify before a grand jury, we've got to go down there and tell what we know. Caldwell was claiming that he didn't have to do that because that would infringe his First Amendment rights. The case had an unhappy result. I consider Earl Caldwell a hero. Anybody know who this guy is? The 7 Dirty Words, yeah, that's George Carlin. That's a young George Carlin. He died a couple years ago. But his case about the 7 dirty words was the beginning of the FCC regulation of, quote, indecency on the airwaves. And that was an unhappy result as well. We'll look at that later. And who's this old gent? My man? Well, he's several generations ago. That's Oliver Wendell Holmes, longtime Justice of the United States Supreme Court, extremely influential in building American law. As you see in this book, he decided the First Amendment case in the United States Supreme Court in 1919. And he got it wrong, caused a lot of mischief, some of which is still with us. He changed his mind later that year and started getting it right in free speech cases. And then his dissent, as the court continued to decide cases limiting the freedom of speech, his dissenting opinions of the court were so eloquent and so persuasive that over time, basically, the current court accepts as gospel what those dissents said. Those dissents became the law over the decades. And then who's the last guy over here? It's also a long time ago. Larry Flynt, the world's leading pornographer, publisher of Hustler magazine, who has many run-ins with the law. He's still in business. But one of his most famous and, for our purposes, most relevant encounters with the First Amendment was when the Reverend Jerry Falwell, the leader of the moral majority at the time, the beginning of the religious right movement in this country, led by Jerry Falwell sued Hustler magazine and Flynt because Hustler ran a vicious caricature of Falwell in which Hustler said that Falwell had sex with his mom in an outhouse and gets drunk before he goes out to the pulpit and preaches every Sunday, which was remotely true. And the case went to the Supreme Court. It's a really important case dealing with what I call injurious speech, speech that hurts people. We don't protect speech because it's harmless. Some speech that actually causes harm is constitutionally protected. And Flynt won that case as well. Then there's the reader for the course, which you need to get right away. If you didn't get a syllabus, don't worry, because it's the first thing in the reader. And I'm pretty proud of this. This is perhaps 27 years worth of work on my part, sort of looking at First Amendment cases over time and synthesizing them. I have summarized many of them. I've edited the decisions themselves. How many of you have read an actual Supreme Court decision on any subject? Really, the decisions themselves. Great. Okay, well, you know how the court sounds then. And I think it's important to read what the court actually says rather than having it filtered through me or a reporter or anybody else, some academic who writes a textbook about the First Amendment. It's important to get it from the horse's mouth. It gives you a sense of how the justices think and how they use language or abuse language in deciding the most important issues of our time. The reader's ready, I'm told, at the Copy Central over on, they just moved a couple of doors away, but they're on Bancroft. That was the reader. Let me mention some housekeeping things about how we're going to proceed here. The B-Space, I'm not a huge fan of B-Space. I find it a little clunky and not terribly well designed, but it's what we've got. It's what they sort of the default, and that's what we'll use. And I consider the B-Space site an important part of the course. If you haven't checked it out, please do. There's an announcements section, and I will post there things you need to know as they come up. We have to cover something different in class, or we're going to do this, or for example, I'll announce the assignment for your paper on the greenhouse book under announcements. Then the syllabus is there. It's under its own tab for syllabus, so you've got the syllabus. You can follow what the reading assignments are for each class and what the subject matter is. Then there's the forums section, which is, you're probably familiar with this, but for our purposes, it's sort of it's a bulletin board where you can post questions or comments. If the questions are of general interest, I mean, whatever you post there, everybody in the class will see. So if it's of general interest, post your question there. I check the thing every day, almost every day, and we'll respond to almost every question. So treat it as virtual office hours, available 24/7. If your question is personal to you, it's a problem, whatever it is, email me directly. Don't post that on the forum site. And then I will, from time to time, post on forums new topics for discussion if you want to discuss them. I'll post one this week, tonight, or before the end of the week anyway, and you can chime in and say your piece about